First of all, I want to thank all the authorities of Iranian Institute of Philosophy who have organized this international conference on Ibn Sina. I'm supposed to introduce myself, a difficult task, of course. I'm Ihsan Karim Torshizi, having done a bachelor and master in mathematics and philosophy of science. I received my PhD in philosophy from Allame Tabatabai University, Iran, and my PhD thesis was on a comparative study between Heidegger and Wittgenstein from an anthropological perspective. And so I've done some researches on philosophical and the history of philosophical anthropology and on phenomenology, particularly Heidegger, and German idealism. You may consider my article not as an article, not from a specialist, but by an outsider. Okay. Before beginning, let me give some preliminary remarks on the history of the term anthropology, the term that has been used in the title of this conference, and I use it frequently throughout my article as well. This term did not exist in ancient Greek. It's very important. We do not find it in pre-Socratics and Plato. Aristotle uses the word anthropologos in his Nicomachean Ethics, but in a quite irrelevant sense, translated into English by David Ross as gossip, the person who talks a lot about other people, totally irrelevant. And it did not exist in early Latin philosophy and Hellenistic philosophy. Some religious and theological usages of the word, of some forms of anthropology in the verb, the infinitive, may be found in early Christian theology, in the sense of anthropomorphism, with a rather blasphemous, profane connotation to characterize God in terms of human attributes, to assign to God human characteristic in order to understand him, in order to describe him. Again, totally irrelevant. It did not exist throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. It's very important. It must be noted. The first famous relevant use of the word anthropology, of course, it is in the late 16th century, particularly within German scholastic philosophy. And it's very, very important to notice, not in ancient Greek, not in early Latin philosophy, not in Hellenistic philosophy, not throughout the Middle Ages, but in the very beginning of Renaissance. And there it was used as a substitution for psychology, not as a synonym, as a substitution for psychology. Underlying this change in terminology was a concomitant changement radical in philosophical basic orientation towards human being. Philosophical anthropology was about to emerge as an autonomous discipline entirely independent of metaphysics and theology on the one hand, and empirical natural sciences on the other. The second significant usage is in Kant, Immanuel Kant, the gravitational point of philosophical anthropology, whose Vorlesungen über Anthropologie incessantly continued throughout his academic career from years before the publication of the first critique until the very last year of his academic endeavor, culminating in the publication of Anthropologie in pragmatischer Hinsicht. Kant brought about an anthropological turn in philosophical thought, a post-Kantian anthropological horizon unfolded and has been remained dominant on Western philosophy, particularly in Europe, since 18th century. Finally, the third significant usage comes about in the early 20th century by Max Scheler, Helmut Plessner, Arnold Gehlen, and people like them, who launched and established a new discipline, but also a new Denkrichtung, as a new paradigm of thought, a philosophical paradigm called philosophical anthropology. According to its historical background, therefore, it seems not appropriate to subsume Ibn Sina's rational psychology under the epithet of anthropology. Then the question arises, in what sense it is used here? I suggest we use it in a very broad, however inaccurate sense of the term. Whatsoever Ibn Sina has said or written specifically apropos of human being from his own philosophical perspective. This is the sense in which this term might be applied to every philosophical treatment of human being, be it explicitly or implicitly. Okay, so much for the history of the term and its clarification. Let me now turn to my article and read parts of it. Ibn Sina's Metaphysics of Human Subjectivity. Okay, I cannot shift my... Oh, okay. Introduction, centrality of anthropology. Rational psychology, ilm al-nafs, the central thrust of which consists in the study of human soul, hence the legitimacy of subsuming it under the epithet of philosophical anthropology, lies so deep at the heart of Ibn Sina's entire philosophy, so decisive for the direction of his lifelong philosophical thought, that it is likely to be deemed as constitutive of the cornerstone of his philosophy in its entirety. It becomes evident once one considers both the terminus a quo and the terminus ad quem of the philosophical path traversed by Ibn Sina throughout his career, from his very first philosophical work entitled Compendium on the Soul to the very last one entitled On the Rational Soul. A remarkable fact that is so much indicative of the whole orientation of Ibn Sina's philosophical thought throughout his life. The same holds true with regard to his most mature and most comprehensive philosophical work, Remarks and Admonition, Isharat al-Tanbihat, which besides an independent part specifically devoted to the proper subject of psychology, the third class, also consists of a closing part including 8th, 9th, and 10th classes on mysticism or gnosis, intended in truth purely and simply for the exposition of certain states and stages that human soul may go through in the course of its perfection, and hence may well be considered in turn as a continuation of the psychology part. Okay, I must skip some sentences. Okay, so much for the centrality of anthropology in Ibn Sina's conception of philosophy as a whole. What follows are a few thoughts on Ibn Sina's philosophical anthropology by special attention to his most mature work, Isharat. Not the least of the peculiar characteristics that Ibn Sina's discourse on anthropology displays is its twofoldness. Vis-a-vis what is traditionally thought to be as a single, uniform, consistent theory, more or less a la Aristotelian theory of soul. Prima facie, this twofoldness alludes to the ambiguity laid at the very semantic core of the word nafs. Both in Arabic and Persian, the word nafs bears two meanings, self, and soul. It is not always easy to distinguish them, and it is out, yes, to distinguish them, and it is out of the context that one must decide which one is intended in each case. One finds a notable instance of this ambiguity among the very definitions of philosophy that Al-Kindi has quoted from the ancients. They, quote, they also defined it, philosophy, by saying philosophy is man's knowledge of himself. Perhaps the oldest of all definitions of philosophy rooted in ancient Greek. Although in the context of the traditional definition, nafs must indeed be translated as self, Al-Kindi's comments suggest that he understands it here to mean soul. For some reasons, I prefer to use the word subject and subjectivity, denoting the subject's proper mode of being, instead of self. The true philosophical meaning of these two concepts, subject and soul, will be explicated in what follows in this article in a moment. For the time being, suffices it to say that the central defining features of the former is self-consciousness, of the latter its essential correlation with a body. As strange as it may seem, Ibn Sina's philosophical anthropology remains keenly sensitive to separate and distinguish between two discourses, between a quasi-biographical descriptive discourse on the life of a self-conscious subjectivity on one hand, and the kind of traditional discourse centering around Aristotelian conception of soul on the other. Notwithstanding the fact that they are thought to be metaphysically identical. People usually tend to construe it as a single uniform discourse, taking the former as merely a preliminary stage of the latter. Instead of such degrading of one to the other, this article insists that Ibn Sina's philosophical anthropology will prove to be much more fertile, much more congruent with our immediate self-understanding, once it has been embraced and acknowledged as it properly is, in its intrinsic twofoldness, in its being essentially composed of two irreducible discourses or perspectives, each capturing one essential aspect of human self-understanding. Okay. Next page, please. I have no control on my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, second section. I'm sorry for the problems. Second section, the outset of the subject discourse. The third class on psychology begins with the subject discourse. Its first chapter is devoted to establish the very existence of human subject. The whole chapter bears the title admonition, meaning that it is a matter of prime knowledge, i.e., it is self-evident and needs no proof. The knowledge of ourself is primary. It is not acquired by means of concepts, definition, and judgments, proof, and argument. So the very first sentence introduces and at the same time establishes human subject as a central concept of the whole discourse, just by simple instruction. By simple instruction, return to thyself and reflect. Irji ila nafsika wa ta'ammal. Return to thyself and reflect. The rest of the chapter provides only some admonitions and reminders in order to assist the reader in carrying out this instruction. Return to thyself and quote, return to yourself and reflect. If you are healthy or red, thank you. if you are healthy, or rather in some states of yours other than health, such that you discern and think accurately, do you ignore the existence of yourself and not affirm it? To me, this ignoring and not affirming does not befit one who has mental vision. Oneself does not escape, even the one asleep in his sleep and the intoxicated in his intoxication, even though its representation to oneself is not fixed in memory. Ibn Sina thus mentions, Ibn Sina thus mentions different states of consciousness in order to remind us of the very presence of human subjectivity, self-awareness in every single moment of a conscious life. In other words, he considers our subjectivity as an essential concomitant of our being conscious. To be conscious of something is to be conscious of the self as the subject of consciousness. Consciousness is at bottom correlated with self-consciousness. Then he introduces his very famous argument, al-insan al-mu'allaga, universal suspended.
Excuse me, Dr. Karimi. Whenever you would like to turn over the slide, just give us a hint, like next we will do it for you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Then he introduces his very famous argument, al-insan al-mu'allaga, universally acknowledged as suspended person, floating man, flying man, or hanging man argument, cleverly designed to render this mostly implicit self-conscious subjectivity as explicit as possible. Further, if you imagine it, okay, I skipped the quote. You know all of it's universally acknowledged. It goes without saying that it is not properly speaking an argument. Perhaps it would be better described as a thought experiment of a sort, artfully devised to envisage an idealized situation in which human subjectivity per se reveals itself in its full-fledged presence as a substantial self-consciousness, i.e. as a substance which is at once conscious and beyond consciousness by being conscious that it is conscious, by being aware of its own consciousness. As he writes clearly in his notes, ta'liqat, you may see the quote on my PowerPoint, when the self occurs, with it occurs also the consciousness of it. Then this consciousness is constitutive of the self, and its consciousness of itself is an absolute one. That is, it is not conditioned in any way. Then it, the self, is indeed the constant consciousness of itself continually, not from time to time. Subjectivity thus revealed is to constitute the central core and intrinsic orientation of Ibn Sina's subject discourse, as we shall see in a moment. Please, next page. Thank you. Before proceeding further, however, we need to delve deeper into the concept of self-consciousness as the kernel of our subjectivity as such. Such characterization may make self-consciousness highly susceptible of being interpreted and understood in terms of a higher order consciousness theory, higher order consciousness theory of a sort a la Armstrong higher order perception or Rosenthal higher order thought. Strangely enough, Ibn Sina himself developed such a conception in his notes, ta'liqat, not as a definition of self-consciousness, but as an essential prerequisite for knowledge to be certain. It formulates certitude in terms of being knowledgeable of one's own knowledge. However, he also stipulates that this transcending procedure must continue in an infinite concatenation of ever-increasing higher orders. One's being certain of X, one's being certain of X consists in at once one's knowing X and one's knowing that one knows X and one's knowing that one knows X, and so on ad infinitum. Let us not assume it to be merely a futile play of fiction. It could be roughly stated in mathematical notations as follows. Please, next page. For all x here, x is equal to an infinite series of hierarchical orders. Self-apprehension, please, next page. Thank you. Self-apprehension is said to be such a certain knowledge par excellence, and it may be formalized as follows, as Cx is equal to Ks plus Kks plus Kkks to an infinite series of. It amounts to an infinite sequence of nested hierarchical orders. Second order, third order, fourth order, and yes. As I said earlier, it is the definition of certitude, of which self-consciousness is considered to be only a paradigm, and ought not to be mistaken for a definition of self-consciousness itself, yet it speaks a significant aspect of self-conscious subjectivity. Subject as such involves a transcendental moment in itself. It is always conscious of itself by being for itself, and by virtue of this being for itself, it is always beyond itself. There is thus a latent infinity, a praxis in infinitum inherent in self-conscious subjectivity that does not express save through an infinite series of transcending orders. Next page, please. Such an interpretation Such an interpretation, though it may not entirely accord with what Ibn Sina truly intended, suggests a profound truth. Consciousness and self-consciousness fall into two totally different categories. They belong to entirely different spheres. If one intends to define self-consciousness reflexively in terms of consciousness, he inevitably must do it in an infinite progress, since the former is not conceivable in terms of the latter unless as an infinite ideal. Ibn Sina proceeds then to delve further into the inner structure of self-consciousness in the second and the third chapters. In fact, they each seeks to specify that in the said assumption of a suspended person argument, however, in all states of consciousness, who is the knower, what is the known? Ibn Sina's own words, with what do you apprehend yourself at that time, prior to that time, and posterior to it? Also, what is it of yourself that is apprehended? His answer is as follows. Let me skip his answers. This does not mean, however, that self-consciousness is a structure according to a reflexive self-referential relation. It is not a kind of reflexive consciousness essentially similar to our consciousness of other things, except whose object and subject. Next page, please. Thank you. It is not a kind of reflexive consciousness essentially similar to our consciousness of other things, except whose object and subject happen to be identical with each other in this special case. Such a conception makes self-consciousness impossible from the bottom up, leading to either a vicious circle or an infinite regression. Self-reference requires the prior possession of some notion of oneself as distinct from other things and subjects. Otherwise, it will either not be self-reference or inevitably entail the structure of an infinite hierarchy of orders. That is the underlying insight behind Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. In either case, self-consciousness collapses from within. That is why all reflexive, whether higher order or self-referential, theories of self-consciousness ultimately fails to explain it. They have no recourse but to either presuppose the consciousness of self to explain self-consciousness from the very outset, because in turning back to itself, subject must already recognize itself, both as the launching subject and the distinct object of the reflection, or beg the question at the end, because in turning back to oneself, one has to already know that it is he and not something else. Rather, subject is conscious of itself by its being for itself. It requires indeed a kind of self-relation much more original than reflexivity or self-referentiality. Self-consciousness is to be understood in terms of subject's purely reflexive, absolute, perpetual intimacy with itself. In the fourth chapter, Ibn Sina intends to unfold an essential aspect of subject which proves to be of profound significance and highly consequential. The epistemological, next page please. The epistemological priority of the fact of subjectivity over all its acts and effects, inasmuch as it is impossible for subject to be proved or even defined on the basis of them. He advances his argument in two ways. In two ways. First, from a specific aspect, i.e., according to the specific assumption of suspended person argument, it is impossible because one is assumed to be entirely isolated from all one's acts. Second, from a general aspect, according to a posterior argument, i.e., a demonstration from effect to cause, a logical dilemma occurs. If the fact is assumed to be the specific act or movement of a subject, then it entails begging the question, because one's subject is inevitably and necessarily presupposing one's act or movement as it is supposed to be one's own act or movement. Second, if the fact is assumed to be an absolute act, then from an a posteriori argument follows merely an absolute subject, not my own specific subject. It goes without saying that in this chapter, Ibn Sina had already precluded from the outset all the unfortunate consequences of the kind centuries later stemmed from the profound misread of René Descartes' cogito ergo sum as an a posterior argument for inferring soul's existence from the reality of its thinking. So the initiating admonition and its few ensuing chapters, next page please. So the initiating admonition and its few ensuing chapters, however brief, present a very rich and vivid characterization of the most basic features of human subjectivity as it is unfolded in its full-fledged presence through the hanging man argument. And next page please. This thought experiment is frequently cited, referred to, and invoked again and again as the discourse proceeds, indicative of the constitutive and formative influence it has on subject discourse in its entirety. We shall return to this thought experiment and the canonical role it assumes in the whole subject discourse later on. For the moment, let us just summarize briefly the most basic characteristic of human subject attained by subject discourse thus far. One, the essence of subject is self-consciousness. It is what constitutes constitutes subjectivity as such. 2. Self-consciousness is not to be conceived as a reflexive or self-referential relation of subject to itself. Rather, it is a pre-reflexive self-intimacy or self-familiarity that subject permanently and perpetually possesses. Subject's constant being for itself. Third, subject is always conscious and beyond consciousness by its being conscious that it is conscious. Subject thus transcends always beyond itself. And fourth, at the core of this self-intimacy, thus latently lies an absolute infinite moment, inevitably unfolding itself in the sphere of consciousness as a series of ever-increasing higher orders progressing in indefinitely. Third section, please next page. The outset of the soul discourse. Thank you. Having given such an accurate, though ever succinct portrayal of the most basic characteristic of human subjectivity, Ibn Sina abruptly interrupts the subjectivity discourse in order to initiate a discourse on another kind, namely the traditional kind of discourse on the Aristotelian concept of soul. The second discourse is entirely Aristotelian in its direction, and this redirection inevitably requires another beginning, a beginning entirely different from the kind of beginning with which Ibn Sina began the psychology part of admonition. This second beginning, more precisely the beginning of the second discourse, takes place in chapter 5, where he attempts to demonstrate the existence of soul as some kind of form by means of its certain acts like movement and apprehension. The pivot of the argument is that the soul exists and is distinct from body and its elemental mixture and temperament, because when an animal volitionally moves, it is moving by something other than his corporeality, which also belongs to other beings, and by something other than the temperament of his body, which often hinders him in the state of his movement, in the direction of his movement, and indeed in his movement itself. The inner principle of volitional movement, i.e. soul, differs from body and its temperament because the latter often appears in movement as resistance or inertia. Soul and body has different propensities. One is the inner principle of volitional movement, and the other is the hindrance and resistance. Thus, from the principle of indiscernibility of identicals by modest tolerance, it follows that they are not identical. This argument may be formulated based on perception as well. It also demands a principle other than the body's common corporeality and its elemental mixture. In any case, it is the very beginning from which he departs in his other psychological works, the healing, for example, on a skeptical. Hence, it appears that, next page, please. Hence, it appears that there is a sharp contrast between chapter 4 and 5 as to what they are to substantiate. The latter establishes soul by mediation of its effects, by appealing to a posterior argument of a sort that the former definitively and categorically denies the possibility of its application to the subjectivity. It's very important. It thus provides a sound basis of comparison between subjectivity and soul in terms of their epistemological status, meaning that taking our acts and movement as the basis of comparison, the human subject reveals to be epistemologically prior to the soul. From this conspicuous contrast, therefore, one may extract a very basic epistemological criterion, henceforth referred to as epistemological difference, for distinguishing clearly between the two. This epithet denotes the principle of the epistemological priority of subjectivity over the soul. Moreover, it must be noted that what is proved by this a posterior argument is the soul in its broadest sense. That includes vegetative, animal, and human soul. Soul thus proved here as the inner essential principle or origin of vegetative, animal, and human life. As is generally known, it is also the very famous traditional argument not only for the existence of soul in its broadest sense, but also for the existence of nature, or in natural species forms that are immanent in natural entities. In the second book of physics, Aristotle had already defined the nature of a thing as a certain principle and cause of change and stability in the thing, thereby distinguishing natural from artificial entities. According to this definition, besides simple bodies, earth, air, fire, and water, plants and animals are also subsumed in the category of entities that exist by nature. In the physics of the healing, Ibn Sina likewise places great emphasis on the close tie between souls and nature, but he prefers to narrow down the scope of the term nature, restricting it merely to non-animal natural entities, and tries to distinguish them by way of the kind of action each produces. Accordingly, nature is the principle of uniform non-volitional action. Celestial soul is the principle of uniform volitional action. Vegetative soul is the principle of non-volitional action, and animal soul is the principle of non-uniform volitional action. There is thus a near kinship between soul, nature, and form. Okay, this chapter concludes by explicating the reference of the word soul. Okay.
Excuse me, Dr. Karimi. It would be pleasure for us to have discussions and question sections more than the concluding notes. If it is possible in 5 to 10 minutes, that would be great for us. And then you will have questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, I will accelerate my reading. Okay, please go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. And the next, please. Chapter 6 begins with the assertion that the soul and the subject are metaphysically one and the same. This substance in you is one. Rather, when verified, it is found to be you. Soul is a unity equipped with powers and branches spreading through body's organs. Hence, there is an interaction between soul and body due to the close interrelatedness that exists between soul's branches and body's organs. Taken for granted that Ibn Sina considers both the subject and the soul metaphysically identical, however, it does not mean that one should simply neglect the epistemological difference and the different anthropological discourses constructed based on them. Next page, please. Ibn Sina's twofold philosophical anthropology. And next page, please. Next slide. Thank you. Ibn Sina's twofold philosophical anthropology. In his critical commentary on Isharat, Fakhruddin Razi has argued against Ibn Sina to the effect that one indeed apprehends oneself without being even aware of what is usually called soul by philosophers, i.e. soul in the Aristotelian traditional sense. Hence, what has been said thus far about our self-awareness is totally irrelevant to the rest of the third class that is mainly concerned with the Aristotelian conception of soul. This incisive remark has been harshly criticized and dismissed by Khaja Nasiruddin Tusi as being entirely irrelevant and lacking understanding of what Ibn Sina says. He even condemns Razi's character and criticizes his personality for being hypocrite and feigning ignorance at numerous points to seek nearness to and please the ignorant populace. It was quote from Tusi. True that Razi is obviously and notoriously wrong in many ways in his extensive criticisms of Ibn Sina. It seems to me, however, that he is absolutely right and justified in claiming that the soul and the subject have different epistemological statuses and ought not to be confused or simply identified with each other. In his discussions, Al-Mubahasat, Ibn Sina also gives an interesting comment explaining what he personally thinks of this kind of argument. Hanging back. He explains that this kind of argument is based on an inference from a person's consideration of his own condition and requires one to thoroughly examine oneself, thus resting on assumptions and premises that only some people are able to realize. Ibn Sina thus sharply distinguishes between these two kinds of argument. The first one requires us to put ourselves into an imaginary situation, grasping and remaining fully committed to what becomes most directly accessible to us in this way. It thus rests entirely on an inference from one's direct personal subjective experience of oneself. The second one, on the contrary, requires a substantial amount of objectivity, conceptualization, syllogism of the sort common in Aristotelian traditional philosophy. The former culminates in the assertion of one's own subjectivity. The latter establishes the soul as what is common to human species, and each of them is deemed appropriate for a specific kind of person. They are not only two different arguments, but they also demand two different ways of philosophizing, two different discourses on human being, interwoven in a twofold double perspective of anthropology. In initiating, next slide please, the next one. In initiating chapters of this class, however concise they are, Ibn Sina has already developed not only a rich and complex concept of human, next one please, human subjectivity, but also, and next one please, but also an entirely new way of thinking that can be characterized under the epithet of reditus in se ipsum, a return on or into oneself. This direction, this return to, this is quote from Heidegger, this return to Rückgang auf the ego, to the soul, to the consciousness, to the spirit, and to the Dasein. To Dasein, as Heidegger puts it, is necessary for certain factual and objective sachlich reasons. Moreover, this explicit orientation of the philosophical problematics on the subject, this returning to and direction towards the subject in its broadest sense, is the only possible and right one. Philosophy thus characterized is inevitably reduced to a biography of the human subjectivity, a detailed and articulated description of the life of a self-conscious subject in its temporal process of self-determination through knowing and acting. It amounts to an anthropology from first-person perspective. The second discourse takes human soul as its core concept, yet instead of subjectivity and its various inner, the next slide, please. Next one. It begins its investigation from outside, from nature, and particularly from living organisms. Its investigation, so to speak, is externally oriented towards life in general, taking an objective approach in order to elicit from it the most general characteristics of soul as the inner principle of life in a body. The soul discourse consequently centers around the different forms of composites, going forth from the mineral forms to the vegetative, animal, and ultimately into the human soul. This brings about a close affinity between psychology and physics, inasmuch as it is physics that the true beginning of psychology is to be located. And it is from nature that the soul discourse is to proceed, treading a rather developmental path of matter from the state of inanimateness, the inorganic state of non-living natural entities, to the living organisms, and to the world of human soul. Okay, let me conclude. Please go to the next slide, and the next one. Okay, this is some kind of schematic view of the difference between the two discourses. The first discourse, subject discourse, and the second discourse, soul discourse, have different core concepts, have different point of departure. They have different overall orientation. One is reflexive, internally oriented. The other is externally, objectively oriented. And they have different manner of conceptualization, and also the approach of the first discourse is first person, and the approach of the second one is third person. And also they have different destination, that one ends with metaphysics of subjectivity, mysticism, I call it, and the other metaphysics of rational soul. Thank you for your attention.
So much, Dr. Karimi, for really wonderful presentation. You did a great task. You, on the basis of Augustinian and Aristotelian corpus, you privileged to establish a new approach to subjectivity, as well as philosophical anthropology. It was really a great honor for us to have you in this conference.
Thank you.
I take this opportunity to see if there is any question, points, or comments among the participants before concluding today's session. It would be great to turn on the microphone of any participants would like to raise their questions or point out to any remarks.
No, I have you. I hear you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Janssens is going to leave us. Please take your time, Professor Janssens. It was a great occasion for us to have you as a speaker, and also your comments. Thank you so much. Please take your time. Professor Charles Hogg is also among us. I would like to ask him if you would like to add any point or comments. We would like to see his comments. If he would like, we can turn on his microphone. It's entirely up to you, Professor Hogg. Just give us a hint, or raise your hand, or anything else if you like. We are going to give you access to a microphone or camera. Professor Rob? As well as Professor Herman Tule, if any comments, questions, objections, anything, we would be happy to have your comments if you. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Hart. No questions. And how about Professor Arizai? We would like to turn on your microphone or camera if you like. If not, no, okay. Just he thanks the presentations and organizers. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions and comments, Professor Arizai. It was a great occasion to have you among us.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I see also Dr. Amilkar, if would like to ask any question, points, remarks at concluding, before concluding the session.
May I turn off my camera, please, Professor Ismail?
Yes, please. Turn on? Yes, please, no problem. It was
Thank you.